All right, welcome to a live edition of The Other Side with Margison and Spears coming to you on a Thursday evening here. Welcome to everybody listening live and those of you that may be listening on rebroadcast. We appreciate your support. I think I mentioned either last episode or a couple of episodes ago now, I've lost track here, that we are really trying to push forward with some stuff to brand and move the podcast in another, in the right direction here and keep some momentum going and everything. And so, as some of you may have noticed, we bumped out the Facebook and the Twitter with the other side. We got the graphics up and going. We're in the process of getting some intro, outro work done, and maybe some other things in the works as well as we continue to try to do what we can to push this message out. We are very, very passionate about education. And, one of the things that in our last episode we talked about with education was this idea that, learning occurs within a certain confined time and space. And often that does such a great disservice, to learning, to the concept of being, open-minded to learning. And so certainly we want to try to pursue all avenues that we have available to encourage people to learn, and using this podcast as a platform for doing that, no matter where you are in your life. If you're in the middle of your career, school and college, everywhere in between, we want to encourage you to think about the topics that we present on this show, and that's what our hope is. That's what our goal is to encourage you to think, and obviously we do that by presenting to you. So with that, I want to bring in and welcome Mike Margison to the broadcast. Mike, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. And Mike and I had some conversations here at the beginning of the week, and kind of mapping out where we wanted to move after our education episode. And he came up with the idea that we've got for our episode tonight, as you can see, or as you may have seen on social media, with the minimum wage. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. It kind of plays off of some of what we had talked about going back to our episode on Venezuela. And certainly we'll introduce some new concepts and ideas with this. But we've got a couple of other things that'll be laid out for you here coming up. And we're excited about, as I said, the direction that the show is going. And again, as always, before we jump into our content, if you want to contact us and leave us any feedback, we would certainly appreciate that. You can get us on all of our social media accounts, Facebook, our new Twitter. We've got The Other Side Podcast on Facebook. Just search for The Other Side Podcast, and same on Twitter as well. Our personal pages, you can get us at that. And then also our email, margisonandspears@gmail.com. And, Mike, I actually did have a couple of people that contacted me in regards to our episode on education and just dropped lines of encouragement. I've had some other people that have come up to me here recently and said, hey, I've stumbled upon your podcast. Somebody told me about it, and I've tried to get caught up on listening to the episodes. So I think that's encouraging.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So hopefully moving in the right direction. And again, if you would help us out with a share, a like, or anything like that, we would greatly appreciate that. So having gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead without further ado and jump into our topic for tonight. And this is something that I know as economics teachers, both Mike, a little bit more expertise on this than I would have. He teaches our AP curriculum out at our school, and has been teaching economics a little bit longer than I have. I tend to a little bit on the governmental side of this, but I'm going to kind of cover with you a little bit of the history here, at least from the government's perspective on the impetus for the minimum wage. Where did it come from? How did the government essentially justify the creation of instituting a minimum wage? And then Mike's going to talk to you more about the effects both on businesses and employers, or businesses and employees in terms of the economic side of that here. So I'll go ahead and jump in with this here. And you might think about if you know much about the way that the government operates, I know one of the questions that I've always had is, where did the government get I guess, for lack of a better term, audacity, right? The impetus for instituting a minimum wage. Now, that's probably not a question that you've ever really thought much about, right? If you've grown up, in your adult life, if you're like me, I'm close to 40, it just is, right? The minimum wage just is. It just exists. It just is a part of the standard operating procedure of running a business here in America. We have state minimum wage laws, we have the federal minimum wage law, and so if you've grown up like me, you just never probably really questioned much of where the minimum wage kind of came from. And so again, as always, we talk about the fact that this being the other side, we want to promote and present to you the unconventional method of educating you and informing you on this topic. So, I think the standard line is, business evil. A lot of what was going on in the United States going back into the 1930s, leading up to that point in time, at least where we start to get in toward the Great Depression, is that, the main cause of that was greed, and that businesses were, operating unfairly. And so, we couldn't just possibly leave the free market to operate itself and to sort this out. We need something, someone, some group, some entity to step in on our behalf, right? And to kind of clean this mess up that free enterprise has created. And, that these evil business owners, these greedy men that are taking advantage of workers, that especially when you look at the Great Depression, wages being what they were, it just really, you had to have something. And where else better to turn than to the power of the federal government, and obviously in particular with FDR, right, and the New Deal. And so the roots of this, right, kind of go back to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, but it actually even goes back a little bit further than that. And goes back to 1932, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was originally drafted by then Senator Hugo Black. And if you're a fan of U.S. history, you may recognize that name. It's not a household name in U.S. history, but Hugo Black would go on to become a Supreme Court justice. And again, if you study much or know much about Black, he was a fairly controversial judge. At one point, he was a card-carrying member of the KKK. He was one who was on record as being very, very much an anti-Catholic. And so he, for example, is in his time on the court, one that upholds the decision in Korematsu, which is the landmark case that was that dealt with the internment of the Japanese during World War II. And so you get the picture, right? I don't want to spend a whole lot of time belittling Hugo Black, but I just wanted to give our listeners a little bit of an insight as to who he was. A Democrat, somebody who obviously looked at the government as the solution bearer for what was going on in the Great Depression. So we end up getting the passage, although it was met with stiff resistance, at least initially. But as FDR kind of worked his magic and broke people down, as he was known to do, they definitely put some revision into the original proposal. And what we end up getting is a couple of things in the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? We get the adoption of the 8-hour day. We get some stuff in there about overtime. But obviously, the one that we're focusing on, and there's some child labor laws in there as well, is the minimum wage, right? The Fair Labor Standards Act affected about 700,000 workers. And this was all a part of FDR, as I said, his New Deal plan. And so this idea of the government having the authority, because where should we go to look to see if the government has the authority to do this? And again, what lays out our government's powers but the Constitution, right? So again, if you're familiar with Constitution, Article 1 deals with Congress. Obviously, this is a congressional act here, a piece of legislation that is being passed. What we should be doing is we should be going through and reading Article 1 and trying to identify where Congress gets the authority to do this, to meddle in in this type of an arena in the market. And over time, especially post New Deal era, we have seen the federal government, in particular Congress, expand its power in working with commerce, right? And the famous Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8, that essentially they just basically uses a blank check to expand their power. And this is what essentially gives Congress the ability and authority to regulate these labor standards, right? In the market, is they claim that it's justified under the Commerce Clause. That this is a part of commerce, right? The production, the manufacturing, the distribution, the selling, and whatnot is all a part of interstate commerce. And so, they really seize on this. And again, they're playing to the emotion of the people at the time who are desperately looking for a situation. And I go back to what Mike said in our Venezuela episode, where we kind of railed on the thing that kind of stuck for. I didn't really understand it at the time that he said it, but I wholeheartedly agree with him that in the short run, right, this will produce a result that is going to be desirable by the people, because the government has deep pockets, they've got a lot of resources. And so here along comes the federal government to step in and save the day. And they do have the authority and the ability to be able to reach deep and to be able to institute change. But in the long run, right, in the long run, what we're going to see are disastrous results. And I don't want to get into stealing Mike's thunder. He's going to talk about the effects in much greater detail than I will. But needless to say, when we examine this from the perspective of what has this meant in terms of government authority and opportunity to expand power since the late 1930s, early 1940s, as I tell my students in government, there's a lot of things that I'm open-minded to hearing you out on in the classroom. And I will hear people out on different ideas and things of that nature. But there is, I think, no debate about the fact that the federal government has expanded its power over time and gone well beyond what the framers had thought the power of Congress to be. I was showing a video in class a couple of days ago that was talking about earmarks. They're talking about bringing earmarks back into the legislative process, and part of the reason for that President Trump brought that up was because it gets things done, right? It's effective. It's a more efficient method for getting things done in a way, in a program, and a system that isn't set up to be efficient. Earmarks kind of help pass legislation a little bit more quickly because you get cooperation and so on and so forth. The whole point of that being that when you look at what government has interjected itself into, even the ardent federalists like Hamilton and Madison and Jay and whoever, they probably would not have seen or agreed with the amount of authority that our federal government now tries and does, not just tries, it does exercise in issues like this. And the final thing that I'll say to wrap it up, and then I'm going to throw it over to Mike here, is that when we look at this is an emotional topic, right? Because you think about the fact that what gets talked about with the living wage, that's the imagery that gets painted in the minds of the voters and the citizens of this country, is that the minimum wage, the living wage, is instituted to provide people with a certain lifestyle, right? And we always hear about income inequality and the wage gap and things of that nature. And so instead of actually looking at studying basic economic principles, what gets discussed is emotion. And I listened to a podcast earlier this week where the gentleman, Brian McClanahan, was talking about this emotive world that we live in today, and how we allow emotion to drive all of our decision making. And so we don't think clearly when we think about, wait, is this a good thing to allow the government the opportunity to seize this power and do this? And in the moment, you might think yes. Going back to what I said earlier, in the moment, it may produce a result that is agreeable to you and that you may like. But at the end of the day, when you look at, whoa, what did we just give away? I think it should cause us pause for concern to say, wow, look at the effects of what this is going to do, not only to businesses, but to individual liberty and things of that nature. And that is something that we should be worried about, right? That is something that we need to pay attention to. And I encourage the listeners to make sure that you are up to date on and be knowledgeable on what rights the government has, what authority is given to the government. I always tell my kids they're always intimidated by the Constitution. When I mention the Constitution, whoa, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not a lawyer. You don't have to be. You can be an 18-year-old college student and read through the Constitution. There are student-friendly versions of it that you can go through and read annotations and come away with a general understanding of what is granted to the federal general government through the Constitution. And if it's not in there, then the question or the answer is very simple. It is a right retained to the people and to the states. And so we do this exercise all the time where I will say, hey, here's something that the federal government is doing. Let's see, where in the Constitution are they granted the authority to be able to do this? And if you can't find it, then what? And, the kids are finally starting to catch on to the idea that, oh, okay, well, if it doesn't say specifically that the federal government can do this, then it's a right retained to the states and to the people. And then we talk about, okay, well, what would that look like and what would that mean? But those are exercises that we should all be doing. Because when we just sit back and cede it over to the government, and in this case, you take the example of the minimum wage and you say, yay, Rob, let's keep raising it. This is a good thing. And don't study not only the economic disastrous effects, but the political implications of this. That is a dangerous thing. So, having said that, I want to go ahead and pitch it over here to Mike to talk about the minimum wage. So again, Mike, when we think about the minimum wage, right, how could you possibly present to me an argument that is going to persuade me to think that the minimum wage is a bad thing? This is something that, if there are people working entry-level jobs, doesn't the minimum wage kind of set the bar and give people more purchasing power? Doesn't it give people, a fighting chance to earn at least a decent wage here? How can you possibly spin this or present this in a way that's going to show me that the minimum wage has disastrous effects?
Well, I'm going to do my best. But let me start with kind of one of the ways that this issue gets conflated. First of all, whether we're talking about free market people or capitalists or Republicans or libertarians or whatever, we are completely fine with people earning a little bit more money. This is something that we are in total agreement with. And I often hear this argument presented, what's wrong with people earning a couple extra dollars an hour in order to improve their lot in life? And my answer to that, my short answer is there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, there's nothing wrong. If somebody earns a few extra dollars an hour, that's great, not only for them, but it's great for the overall economy. Because if they're earning more money, then one, they have more money to spend. They're a little bit more comfortable. It's a little less stress on them. But those earnings are obviously a result of increased productivity. You don't earn a raise just because, the boss woke up one day and just said, I'm gonna bump you $1 an hour. You get bumped because in some capacity you're able to produce more, or you're able to produce more efficiently than you were before. And the way that this obviously benefits the overall economy is that means more goods and services are then produced, and that drives the price of them down. So really, if people are earning higher wages, that's a win-win. So people who are on the right, people who are in my camp, I guess, we are not against people earning more money. But the big difference is people earning money and people getting a raise by government edict are two very different things, right? One is not the other. And if you just say, okay, all of you now, you are earning $15 an hour. that doesn't reflect increased productivity by those people. Whereas if they went through it the other way, maybe they were making $12, $13 an hour. They gained a little bit more experience. They acquired a new skill. They tried something new. They became more efficient, more productive. And the boss says, hey, you're a little bit more valuable to me. I'm going to pay you now $15 an hour rather than $13 an hour. That type of raise is good for the economy. The first type is nothing. It's not reflective of any increase in productivity or any increase in value. It's just the government saying, here, this is what's going to happen. And it doesn't really mean anything at all. I think we showed that when we did the Venezuela episode, and we were talking about the absolute collapse that the economy was having. But then right in the midst of that, Maduro institutes a 30% minimum wage increase, right? As if that means anything. The money now is completely worthless. There are no products. There are no goods and services. The people are eating their pets. So, the government can, issue minimum wages, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. People have to earn more money, and I am all for that. So let's go back and let's look at what happened before the Fair Labor Standards Act, as you brought up. How did people actually earn wage raises before the Fair Labor Standards Act? I mean, we went through an entire period of U.S. history. I would argue that the 60 or 70 years right before the minimum wage was instituted, as far as prosperity, I would argue that that 60 or 70 years was the most economically prosperous time in American history. If you take the time between like the mid 1970s all the way up through the 1920s, this was, in my opinion, the best time for increases in standards of living in all of, not just U.S. history, I guess, in all of world history. I don't think any other point in human history did one person improve their standard of living more so than that 50 or 60 year period. Yet there was no minimum wage laws. So how did this happen? Like what exactly went on here? Well, as I talked about, you have a situation where workers are becoming more productive than they were before. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this had to do with a number of things, but primarily it was their ability to use machinery. Right? This is a relatively new concept that was coming about during the industrial age. But when businesses invested in capital machinery and workers became skilled at using that machinery, then all of a sudden a worker could do the same amount of work that maybe 10 men could do before. They became much, much more efficient. And this represents a whole lot of value to the employer. Hey, all of a sudden, Bob can do 10 times more than he could previously. This is the acquisition of a new skill. What that means is there is now more goods and services going out to the public. Those are getting purchases. That means more revenue for the company. And what does the company do with that revenue? They invest it back into factors of production. And one of those factors of production is labor. Contrary to the just ridiculously simplistic myth that when business owners made profits, they just stashed them away in, fur coats for their wives or, buried the money or something like that. That's not what they do. Even if I grant you that all business owners are greedy, well, that means that they're interested in long-term profits. And in a competitive labor market, in an somewhat unregulated market as we had during the 19th century, in this competitive labor market, you need to fight to keep workers who are valuable to you. If you do want those profits, you need to fight. And one of the ways to keep them is to pay them a higher wage than the factory that's opening up next door. And during the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was factories popping up, factory on top of factory on top of factory right next door to each other. And so this competition actually drove wages up. Not only the competition drove wages up, but the acquisition of skill using capital machinery made workers more efficient, and this drove wages up. So there was no need for any type of, government mandate for employers to pay more. They just did. And, what you typically see in the U.S. history books, or, maybe in a lecture hall in a U.S. history 101 course, is that the Industrial Revolution was just this. It would, like we described Venezuela last week, right? That's how they described the Industrial Revolution in America. It was just, poverty and Hoovervilles and kids getting their arms cut off and just, the monopoly guy sitting there with his monocles just rolling in stacks of cash, and the poor workers didn't have anything. That's just simply a myth. Or all you have to do is go back and look at the data, the labor data, and you'll see that wages rose during the 1800s. They rose during the 1900s. They rose during the 1920s. And these were all at times when we were led to believe that it was just greedy profiteering by these capitalist pigs, and that we were also led to believe that everybody was living in poverty. Simply not the case. The standard of living in America went up at a greater rate than at any other time, and this is my opinion, than at any other time in human history in these decades before the minimum wage increase. So what does this all mean? It means that wages, like in Venezuela, they can't just be given, right? Wages actually reflect a reality, right? Wages, they're a reflection of something. They're a byproduct of certain things. Wages are a byproduct of productivity. They are a byproduct of value. They are a byproduct of trust, of future value. They're a byproduct of the goods and services that you are actually producing, right? Wages are a byproduct of these things. And these are certain economic realities that we have to acknowledge. And if we don't acknowledge these realities, again, like Maduro not acknowledging economic realities and just imposing a minimum wage increase, it doesn't mean anything, right? So let's take a look at a typical fast food restaurant, because I think when people are thinking minimum wage, that's usually what you think of, like a McDonald's type place, a typical fast food restaurant. What are the economic realities that underlie the fast food market? Right? Because there are some consumer markets where, certain goods and services, they simply don't allow a worker, no matter how good, well-intentioned and hardworking that worker is, there are certain product markets that don't allow a worker to generate $15 an hour worth of value. It's just not possible. When people go to McDonald's, when they go through the drive-through, Justin, this probably is the same for you. It's definitely the same for me. When I go to McDonald's, I'm not going there for quality. I'm going there for simplicity, and I'm going there to save a couple of bucks. And we've all gotten that double cheeseburger off of the dollar value meal or menu, whatever it is. And when you open it in your car, it looks like it was put together by somebody with a blindfold on. And overall, it's not a great product, but it's also not anything that we would probably pay more than $1 for. That's what we're after. And that's what Americans often are after when it comes to certain, consumer markets. It's ease, getting something quick, easy, and cheap. And given the fact that this is what Americans want, and this is what competition has dictated, right? Not only does McDonald's have a dollar value menu, but Taco Bell followed suit, and Wendy's has one, and Burger King has one. All of these fast food restaurants that pay minimum wage are simply responding to consumer demand. When you are bringing in $1.25 for a sandwich, and that's all consumers are going to pay for it, the economic reality is you're not going to be able to generate $15 an hour worth of value for your boss. And if the government, if a third party comes along and simply says, waves a wand, poof, we're going to ignore economic reality and we're going to force you to pay this kid $15 an hour, well, then the boss has really two options. Number one, I can raise the price of this thrown together sloppy sandwich that people don't want to pay a whole lot for. And then if I do raise it to $3.50, people certainly aren't going to buy it. Or I can simply just get rid of the worker, right? He or she can't generate $15 an hour worth of value to me. So goodbye, you're going to have to go. And what we see now a lot of times, and I was reading that information coming out of California where Jack in the Box, which is a prominent fast food joint, they're now going to automation. And so when you walk into the doors, rather than being greeted by somebody, there's going to be this large kiosk there, and you just, it's touch screen. It's got all of the options. You can add, subtract, no lettuce. You can do pretty much anything that you want, and then you pay with a card, and all of the workers are just in the back. They get it up there on a computer screen. They, make the food, bring it out, and the people who used to work the register, this job no longer exists. And that's what you're going to see happening when you start pricing this low skill and low wage labor out of the workforce. The reason is because these are economic realities that have to be acknowledged. Other thing that I want to mention is, when I hear these minimum wage debates, they're often talked about kind of like you brought up. They're often talked about in an emotional sense. You hear a lot that term that you brought up, the living wage. You hear that a lot, and that does kind of tug at the heartstrings. But we have to acknowledge that there are some adverse effects to the minimum wage, and this isn't like right-wingers talking. These aren't just capitalists talking. There are some leftist institutions which have acknowledged that there are adverse effects to the minimum wage, and I think that needs to be brought into the conversation. First of all, Seattle got some national prominence when they, I think they were the first major city that decided that they were going to go up to a $15 minimum wage, and they didn't do it all at once. I think at first it went from like $9.25, when that's what it was when this law was put into effect, and it was supposed to graduate up to $15 an hour. So it went from $9.25 to $11, and then $11 to $13, and now that's where it is currently right now, $13 an hour, and it's supposed to, I think by 2019 or 2020, go up to $15 an hour. But what the city of Seattle did is they actually commissioned a series of reports on the economic impact of this legislation. And after the first year, when it went from $9.25 to $11, the reports came back pretty neutral. There was no ill effects, no real, no discernible positive gains, but no ill effects from the wage increase. Well, when the second report came out, and I think this was just over the summer that this happened. It might have been in the spring, but those second reports, when the wage jumped from $11 to $13 an hour, well, they didn't come back so well. This is the University of Washington that did the study, so it's not the Heritage Foundation or some right-wing outlet, but they came back and they said, here's what the data tells us: there are a number of lost hours in low-skill restaurant work, and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of lost wages that have just poof, disappeared. And not necessarily all because of automation, because a lot of the times what a business owner do is they will just double up with, certain employees will have to pick up, if you fire one person and whatever jobs they would have done, you'll get the other 5 employees and you'll kind of tack on 20%, if that makes sense, 20% more work to each of them. And they'll just take on new tasks and that is consistent with the higher wage. They'll have to do more work. But for this one individual, of course, they lost their job. So the minimum wage law actually effectively gave them a wage of $0. So you extrapolate this across an entire economy, and what were the effects? It was, I think, I want to say $125 million lost in wage labor, low skill wage labor during that time period, during the time period from the $11 an hour bump to $13 an hour, and like thousands of labor hours lost, right? So, it's very predictable, but business owners cut back on overpriced labor. It's the law of demand. It's like anything else. When the price of something goes up, we consume less of it. That's the same for a business owner. When the price of labor goes up, they consume less labor. They don't consume more labor. And so that's what we see playing out in Seattle. Now, one story that I really like, this happened, again, I think it was last summer, might have been the spring, but in Baltimore, this lady got elected as mayor, Catherine Pugh. Now, Catherine Pugh is probably somebody we would disagree, she and I, on, I'm guessing, 99.9% of issues. She is a complete committed leftist. And when she was running for mayor of Baltimore, she ran on the Fight for 15. That was one of her big things. And when she became mayor, and she actually had to sit down and look at the issue, She did a complete 180. She reversed on the issue. And she said, you know what's going to happen? Businesses are going to start leaving the city limits. They're going to go out to suburban areas, and they're going to, they're basically going to cross right across the boundary lines when this $15 an hour minimum wage no longer affects them. And we're going to lose that tax revenue. So after looking at the issue from both sides, she said, I simply can't do this. And when the council proposed this to her, she vetoed it. Now, kudos to her, because how many politicians actually look at the issue, look at the facts, and look at the economic data, and then make a decision not based on politics, but based on actual economics? You almost never see that, Republican or Democrat. So this lady's a Democrat. She sat down, she looked at the issue, and she said, in good conscience, it's simple. The bad outweighs the good. And that was almost the exact same language that we saw from the Seattle report. In fact, I read one analysis of the Seattle report where they said, with this new second bump in the minimum wage increase, there are about 3 negatives for every positive. That's kind of what we're seeing. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I heard that too. In looking at the leftist ideas behind the minimum wage. And I was reading through an article on Joseph Stiglitz. Are you familiar with Professor Stiglitz?
Not off the top of my head here.
Okay, he was the chief economic advisor for the Clinton administration. And I believe he was either a Nobel Prize winner or a nominee, but at any rate, he even pointed out the negative of a minimum wage and the negative effects that it has on, as you were mentioning, the impact. When you get to the point where business owners are going to look at this and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let people go. And as the great philosopher Forrest Gump once said, I'm not a smart man, but I think I understand that something is better than nothing, at least the last time that I checked. So, yeah, when you force the hand of these business owners to have to do this, what do you think the reaction is going to be? It's just mind-blowing to me.
Well,
Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
No, that's a great point. But I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think they think about it. I think it's so political and it's just so emotional. It's something that will get some of that short-term, support, and that's good enough. That it's unfortunate, but that's a lot of the time. That's a lot how politics has run, and that will kind of lead me into what I'm going to close with here. Some of the arguments that you hear in favor of the minimum wage that just have to be debunked because they are so pathetic. The first one is that, okay, let me just be clear, and I think I speak for you too. I'm in favor of abolishing the minimum wage. I'm not talking about like not raising it to $15 an hour. I am actually in favor of removing this law from the books. There is no federal mandate on wages. So just to be clear, so people know that. And so the argument against that is that, well, if you do that, this is just going to be a race to the bottom with wages. So, employers they're going to pay the lowest allowable amount if you get rid of the minimum wage. And it's just going to, wages are then going to tank. And that's such a poor argument, because if that were the case, what is the lowest allowable amount right now? It's $7.25 an hour. That is the lowest allowable federal amount. And what percentage of jobs? There are 121.6 million private sector jobs. Less than 1 million pay $7.25. It's 0.5% of these jobs are actual minimum wage jobs. In other words, 99.5% of jobs don't do what the left tells us is going to happen. They tell us that they are going to pay these businesses, these greedy pigs, are going to pay the lowest allowable amount. Well, if that were true, they'd already be doing it, and they're just not. So there's no evidence to back it up. And look, with the data that I'm using, right, there are less than 1 million jobs that are like exactly $7.25. There are actually more than that, double, about 1.2 million that pay less than the minimum wage. But those are largely jobs where people make tips and stuff, like servers. So their effective wage is actually much higher. But even if I threw them in there, right? We're still talking about like 1.7% of all jobs are 725 or less. So the idea that all these employers would just pay, as Nancy Pelosi says, crumbs to the employees if they were allowed to, well, they would be doing that already. They would be paying the lowest allowable amount, yet they're not. Right? Again, the people who are paying the lowest amount are just those industries that can't generate $15 an hour worth of revenue due to whatever that particular market is.
Yeah, and let's not forget here, Mike, real quick too, and if you want to add a comment in here on this as well too, that guys, this is one part of the equation, right? I mean, spending is another part when we talk about the effective wage and what you're able to do in your life. What are you able to afford? What kind of lifestyle are you able to afford? There are people that make hundreds of thousands of dollars that can't support their lifestyle. And I know that seems ridiculous, but I'm using it as an example to say that the amount of money that you make is only a part of the equation. We have to also have conversations about how we choose to spend our money in this country as well. And, we see the reckless spending of people getting in way over their heads with cars, homes, debt. And so it really, sometimes it wouldn't even matter if they were making $15 an hour. Their lifestyle wouldn't support $20 an hour. So, where do you stop with this?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Where do you stop? And where people actually improve their standard of living is A, like you said, when they're prudent with the money that they do have, but B, when they acquire more skill and become more productive and more valuable. This is actually what increases the standard of living. One of the historical arguments that really bugs me about this is the 1920s, right? This is usually given. You mentioned that the bill was first drawn up in 1932. Well, this is when we were just right in the beginning of the Great Depression. And the argument has always been, well, the 1920s was just a decade of greed and excesses and ripoffs. And because of this, the federal government has to step in and regulate the labor market. And if anybody actually, usually those arguments come with absolutely no backup whatsoever, and nobody bothers to look at it. But here is a statistic: the share of corporate profits that went to wages and salaries over the course of the 1920s actually went up as a percentage. So at the beginning of the decade in 1920, the share of corporate profits that went to wages and salaries was 55%. 55% of corporate profits went to wages and salaries. And then throughout the 1920s, when we get to the end of the decade, that number was 60. Yes, during the 1920s, corporate profits went way up, but a larger percentage of them, now 60% of that, went to wages and salaries. So it's just it's a straw man. It's a misnomer that we have to have the government come in because businesses will just be greedy or businesses won't pay people. It's all false. None of the data actually supports it. It's just these wrong, emotional, dumb arguments. I mean, honestly. And then the last thing, this should go without saying, but it's kind of low hanging fruit, but it's so easy. If wages themselves just equaled prosperity, right? If they weren't a byproduct of something else, like I was talking about, if wages were the ticket to prosperity, we could just, every poor country in the world would be fixed by just instituting a $50 an hour minimum wage. Poverty would be wiped out. We could all do that. Everybody with a $50 hour minimum wage, and then we're all living happy. But obviously, you can't get anybody to agree with that because it's so stupid, because wages, just by edict, wages don't mean anything unless they are a byproduct of actual value and actual productivity. So I'm going to stop there and kick it back over to you so we can kind of conclude. But that's my economic take on the situation.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic analysis, and really, again, something that I hope the listener will kind of take to heart a little and look at, what we say here, and don't just take our word for it. Go out and read about it. Go out and look for yourself and study this in detail so that you're informed and prepared to understand the potential pitfalls of what the minimum wage brings. And I think that's the thing at the end of the day that really kind of rubs me, I guess, the most about this is, when you think about the idea of the minimum wage, and the fact that you allow the government the opportunity to come in and dictate what businesses should be doing. Well, why not $50 an hour? Well, where do you stop? What that gets me fired up about this is people don't really fully understand. The market can determine these things if it's left alone. The market will determine your worth, your value based on the laws of supply and demand, and things of that nature, production, if you just let it work. Now, there's going to be winners and losers, right? But I would much rather let the market decide that than some bureaucrat sitting in DC that thinks he or she has the answers to what a company should be paying me based on this idea of the minimum wage. So I think your economic analysis was spot on, and I hope that again that would intrigue the listeners to go out and learn a little bit more economically, study the history behind it, understand what was going on in the country, what gave FDR and Congress the authority to do what they did, and start to put together a reasoned, rational look at this as opposed to an emotional based one. So again, I think that's kind of going to be where we leave this one here for tonight. So again, I really appreciate the time that you guys have put into listening to us. Please feel free to leave any feedback, comments, questions that you have for us. We'd be more than happy to address that and carry it forward. Again, you can reach us on our social media accounts. You can reach us on our email. Again, that's margisonandspears@gmail.com. And until next time, you have now heard the other side.